For the latest in strategic affairs, subscribe to our YouTube channel. Click the bell icon for updates.
Hello and welcome to Stratnewsglobal and welcome to The Gist, our signature show on foreign affairs and security. Our focus this evening is on the Haqqani Network in Afghanistan. And our guest for this evening is Jeff Smith, a research fellow at the Heritage Foundation in the US. You have seen him before. He's been an articulate speaker on South Asian issues. Welcome, Jeff. Glad to have you.
It's good to be here. Thank you.
Jeff has recently written a commentary in the online magazine War on the Rocks, titled The Haqqani Network, The New Kingmakers in Kabul. We have a small graphic on that. If you could just play it. Jeff's argument basically focuses on what he describes as the Haqqanization of the Taliban network, meaning Sirajuddin Haqqani is not only the leader of the terrorist Haqqani network, he is also the deputy emir of the Taliban. We have another small graphic here for you that we'd like to play. As I mentioned, Sirajuddin Haqqani is also the deputy emir of the Taliban. He is in charge of its military strategy and operations, has ties to the Islamic State, is mediating peace talks between Pakistan and the Tehreeh Taliban Pakistan, and he's also driving an agenda of a global jihad. So, Jeff, how did Sirajuddin Haqqani get so powerful? Was it only Pakistani support? Does it go back earlier to the Afghan jihad?
Very good question. I think there are a lot of factors that contributed to the rise of Siraj and the Haqqani Network. The Haqqani Network itself, I think, draws a lot of its power and influence from geography, from the fact that its territory straddles the Afghanistan-Pakistan border, where Waziristan, North Waziristan, meets Loya Patika in Afghanistan. And so having territory on both sides allows the Haqqanis to control the flow of drugs, of personnel, of arms between Afghanistan and Pakistan, which brings with it revenue, power, and influence. They've also done a very effective job launching terrorist attacks in Afghanistan and made a reputation for being very effective at attacking not only the U.S. Embassy, the Indian Embassy, international hotels, five-star hotels, U.S. military bases, CIA outposts. So they earned a reputation as a bloodthirsty terrorist group, and that brought them power and influence. They've also made themselves indispensable to Pakistan by serving as an interlocutor with the Pakistani Taliban and other restive militant groups inside the federally administered tribal areas and North Waziristan. And so for a number of reasons, I think they've been growing inside this sort of jihadist landscape in Afghanistan, Pakistan. They've been rising in prominence for some years. And when the death of Mullah Omar was announced in 2015, there was a bit of a leadership struggle. And I think Siraj wanted to become the new emir of the Taliban. There was a compromise reached in which he was made deputy emir instead. But many people believe he's been wielding very significant influence inside the Taliban since then, and may in fact be the most powerful leader now in the organization. There's a lot of speculation that the actual emir, who hasn't been seen now in at least several months, maybe over a year, is dead, and Siraj Haqqani is already wielding the most power inside the Taliban.
So would you say his position as head of military strategy and operations, that makes him the key guy in the Taliban?
Yes, I think so. I think he not only has control organizationally, but he commands maybe the most fear and respect among the different Taliban leaders and factions. And there's been tension between the Haqqanis, which hail from the Zadran tribe, farther north and east, where North Waziristan meets Afghanistan, and then the traditional Taliban leadership tends to hail from the south around Kandahar, and they're both Pashtun tribes, and they worked together in the past, but they're not perfectly aligned, and the Haqqanis are sort of fiercely independent folks, and they've often been described as autonomous but integral parts of the Taliban. But I would sort of stress the autonomous part and note that they predate the Taliban. They also have closer links than the Taliban does to Pakistan's ISI, as well as to Al-Qaida and probably the Islamic State.
So would you say the Haqqanis now own a state in Afghanistan?
I would say they are key kingmakers in the new Afghan state. Yeah, I mean, likely the most powerful figures inside Afghanistan today. And we saw shortly after the fall of Kabul, there was some bickering between the Haqqanis and Mullah Baradar and the traditional Kandahari sort of Taliban faction. A dispute so serious it seemed that the ISI chief flew to Kabul to mediate and oversee the dispute and the power sharing arrangement, who would get what ministries, who would get credit for the Taliban's victory. And apparently the dispute got serious enough that there were several reports of a fist fight and or shootout between Baradar and the Haqqanis. And Baradar was fled the capital after that, along with probably Mullah Omar's son, Mullah Yaqub. They fled to Kandahar, reportedly to consult with the emir of the Taliban, who's probably dead. And after spending some time in Kandahar, they came back to Kabul and refused a security detail from the Haqqani-led Interior Ministry. And so there clearly is some differences between the Taliban factions, and it's hard not to conclude that the Haqqanis have emerged as the strongest of these different factions, especially because they do appear to have the explicit backing of the ISI.
Since you're taking up the issue of ISI, we have a question here from Shubham Sharma. ISI controls the Haqqani Network, which works against India and US interests. Still, the US keeps supporting Pakistan and does not react to its hypocrisy. Why?
Well, it's a good question. Question I've been asking in Washington for 15 years. I've been supportive of suspending aid to Pakistan since the mid to late 2000s. We can't say there have been no consequences, because there have. President Trump did suspend billions of dollars in U.S. aid to Pakistan, and that has not been reinstated under President Biden. I think there is widespread frustration in Washington and recognition in Washington of Pakistan's double game. So I wouldn't say, there's been no punishment. The recurring problem that we unfortunately yet again face, it's not that people don't know Pakistan is supporting these groups. It's that Afghanistan is unfortunately a landlocked country. Yeah. And if you want to sustain a large troop presence there, like we had to between 2001 and 2020, or if you want to get access to the country again for counterterrorism purposes, you need to work with one of its neighbors because it's landlocked. Yeah. And the United States has a hostile relationship with Iran, and Russia and China wield a veto in some Central Asian countries and won't allow them to work more closely with the U.S. And so you sort of, unfortunately, only have one option left. Now I don't believe, this bargain we had with Pakistan, where there was essentially, if you help provide access to Afghanistan, then we look the other way while you're playing this double game. That was unacceptable to me. That has to change. We cannot enter another arrangement like that again simply because we need access to Afghanistan. I think the consequences were horrific. I think that's in part how we got here, with Pakistan's most loyal proxy in power in Kabul. But I recognize the dilemma that policymakers face. And they're being told, look, Al-Qaeda is a potential threat, a rising threat. The Islamic State is a potential threat in Afghanistan. We need to have some kind of capability to monitor them, to gather intelligence, and to respond if necessary. And unless you're working with one of Afghanistan's neighbors, that job gets considerably more difficult. And so, again, it's the catch-22. I hope that whatever sort of new arrangement or new relationship they work out with Pakistan, it's understood that the old double game was unacceptable. And you cannot change a country's cost-benefit calculation without imposing costs or threatening real costs. And that's something the U.S. did not do. It occasionally threatened to withhold aid, and it lectured Pakistan, but it never really imposed serious costs for its support to terrorist groups. President Trump was the first, and that didn't end Pakistan's support, but it also didn't cause Armageddon or a fundamental rupture in the relationship, as some people had warned for a long time.
So let's get back to Afghanistan. With the Haqqanis now in the saddle in Kabul, and given his ties to all these groups, the Tehreeh Taliban, Islamic State, and so on, do you see Afghanistan re-emerging as a playground for terrorism as so many years ago?
Well, it's a very real threat, and the Biden administration has acknowledged as much. Senior officials just in the past few weeks have said they believe Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State in Afghanistan have the intent to launch attacks on the U.S. and its allies and interests abroad, and that Al-Qaeda could develop that capability within 6 months. And the Islamic State would likely take around a year. And, that may even be optimistic. But I think it's significant that the U.S. government is on record saying that this is a real and emerging threat, which is what's what's motivating them to work out some kind of arrangement somewhere that can give the U.S. Counterterrorism capabilities in Afghanistan beyond this sort of over-the-horizon option, which is limited.
Do you believe, given the issues with Pakistan, do you really believe you can go back to that situation where the US was operating drone flights out of there, and as in the past? I mean, is that really feasible again? And why should the Pakis do it?
It depends on I guess the mood in Islamabad. I mean, if you're an American military planner, you want you want the ability to fly drones into Afghanistan again. You want the ability to monitor Haqqani Network figures, Al-Qaeda figures, Islamic State. You want the ability to collect intelligence. And so, of course, the U.S. would desire that capability. I mean, I'm sure they would probably prefer it come from Tajikistan, but Russia and China are not really allowing those type of negotiations to move forward. And so, if you want that capability somewhere, they probably would desire that. Now, would the Pakistanis allow it, and what would be traded in return is the key question. And for me, it can't be a return to business as usual. Well, since we have a drone base, then we don't mind if you continue supporting these groups. That has to end.
Mhm. There have been some friendly noises from Kabul about India, But in your analysis, in your thinking, exactly what should India be doing here? What do you believe the Taliban really thinks about India? What do you think they want?
Hmm. Well, that's a very good question. Unfortunately, I think, like the United States, India's options are limited, and it gets back to the Afghanistan's geography. India, I think, is in a slightly better position in some ways because it does have a reasonable working relationship with Iran, and therefore does have a land corridor to Afghanistan. And I understand there are attempts being made to get another land corridor open through Pakistan, at least for humanitarian aid purposes, which isn't going particularly well. Look, India can be supportive of the Afghan people, can continually sort of emphasize how important it is that the government maintain commitments to human rights, minorities, women, and not become a base for terrorism again. I do think there are probably factions of the Afghan Taliban. I would hesitate to call them moderate because I don't think they are moderate. I don't think you can, beat women in public and deny them the right to go to school and be a moderate. You're not. You're a radical. You're a fundamentalist. But you may be concerned primarily with implementing your radical vision inside your own country's borders and not have ambitions of a broader regional or global jihad, like I think some of these groups do. I think Qaida and the Islamic State and probably some Haqqani factions and maybe even some of the Taliban factions do harbor ambitions beyond Afghanistan's borders, but I think there are others who don't and want international aid and recognition and have made noises about wanting a good relationship with India, who certainly for their own self-interested reasons would like to see aid and trade and recognition. But how powerful are those sort of more pragmatic factions, and are they really in charge right now, or is it the Haqqanis and the radicals? And I think that's something that everyone, all governments, U.S., Indian, and otherwise, are trying to figure out right now.
There's a comment from Aditi Pathak, one of our viewers, that the Haqqani's power, sorry, this has just gone up. The Haqqani power lies in the fact that they are supported by the ISI, not that they are very influential by themselves. Would you agree with that?
No, I don't think so. I think their relationship with the ISI is a significant source of their power. Yes, absolutely. But their links with these militant groups in North Waziristan, in some ways, they have made themselves indispensable to the ISI. And the ISI does fear rebellion and separatist sentiments and independence and Pashtun nationalism among the Pashtun tribes that straddle the border. That's a deep-held anxiety for the Pakistani state and for the ISI. And they want to avoid sort of all-out warfare with the Pakistani Taliban and allied militant groups. They want to avoid having to go into the Fatah and North Waziristan with large-scale forces and stirring up a hornet's nest, frankly. And so having the Haqqanis there to negotiate with these tribes and cut peace deals and get them to focus their attention on Afghanistan rather than on attacks inside the Pakistani state is a very valuable asset for the ISI. And so I think in some ways the ISI is very important to the Haqqanis, and the Haqqanis are very important to the ISI. I would agree with the questioner that the ISI support is a very significant source of their power and influence, but not the only one.
Mhm. Do you see a deterioration of the situation in Afghanistan, perhaps even a conflict within the Taliban, or do you think Sirajuddin is the guy in charge? He's in control.
It's very hard to say. I think it is possible to have a internal struggle within the Taliban. We haven't seen that yet. That would be sort of new and unprecedented, open hostility and open conflict between the sort of Kandahari faction and the Haqqanis. But if we're at the stage where they're getting in fistfights and gunfights, then it's hard to rule that out entirely as a possibility. I'm sure the ISI and other factions are doing the best they can to make peace among the groups and paper over any differences, because that's the last thing they want to see is a civil war under those conditions. But is it possible? Yeah, I think it is possible. It's very hard for us to read the situation in great detail. I mean, this isn't a particularly transparent organization, right? We don't know all the details and the inner workings and who's fighting against who, and we're making essentially educated guesses from open source information. But from what we can tell, the tension between the two factions does appear to be real. I think it's unlikely that spills over into open conflict, but not impossible.
Mhm. So last question, what does Sirajuddin hope to gain through a global jihad? What does he want?
That's a very interesting question. I would get back to the lack of transparency to say, we really don't know what he wants. But we do know that he does appear to be more radical and more global in his orientation than his father was. Jalaluddin was primarily concerned with Afghanistan. First, he was concerned with the Afghan government, launching attacks against the Dawood government in the 1970s. And then he was against the Soviets after their invasion. And then he eventually allied with the Taliban in the Civil War. And then he fled to Pakistan and was launching attacks against U.S. forces. But in each case, his focus was on Afghanistan and mostly Eastern Afghanistan, where the Haqqanis have their stronghold and their power base. And by most indications, Siraj sort of has adopted more of this global jihadist al-Qaida mentality. Under him, the Haqqanis did send fighters to Syria to aid the Islamic State. He published a global jihadist manifesto, while he's been the head of the Haqqani Network, that praised al-Qaida, that praised suicide bombings, that urged people to travel to the West and launch attacks and behead the enemies and strike fear in their hearts. I mean, very much al-Qaida, Islamic State type language. And we've also seen, since he took over, that the Haqqanis have only grown closer to al-Qaida, and likely the Islamic State too. The Islamic State is now headed by a former mid-level Haqqani commander. And although it has been engaged in a very fierce turf battle with the Taliban, operational ties to the Haqqani network have been established and are likely growing. And so there are a lot of signs that point to this more sort of global jihadist orientation under Siraj. But what we don't know, what no one knows, is how does that translate now that they're in control of a country? And to what degree are they going to permit al-Qaida and the Islamic State to train and launch operations abroad or encourage them to do so? We simply don't know, because until now he's been the head of a terrorist organization in hiding. And that's a big step to go from Miram Shah in North Waziristan to ruling the country in Kabul. So we're going to have to.
Yeah. Yeah. Just Smith, on that note, thank you. Pleasure talking to you, and grateful for your insight and your perspective. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much.
And for all of you out there with your comments and questions and observations, please keep them coming. Glad to have them. Subscribe to our YouTube channel. Visit our website. Thank you. Good night.